Hey guys, today I'm here with the JKS Jspec 3.5-inch lift kit fitting all 2007 to 2018 four-door JK Wranglers. So this is going to be for the JKU owner looking to comfortably fit a 35-inch tire in your wheel well without sacrificing on-road ride quality. So if you're looking for a high-quality lift kit to get your JK ready to conquer the trails, this kit by JKS will be a great option to take into consideration. So there are a ton of different lift kits to choose from on the page right now, and trust me, I've been there, I've done that. You want to choose a great lift kit that's going to be the best one for you and your JKU. So a 3.5-inch lift kit is just in the middle ground between getting good flex and being able to conquer those trails while still maintaining a good height for some good drivability while you're out on the street. So this JKS kit will accomplish both of those and still give you an aggressive stance to your JKU while coming with all of the components that you need to install this, including your coils, your shocks, a front adjustable track bar, and quicker disconnects, as well as all the brackets to accommodate for that lift. So this won't come with lower control arms, adjustable control arms, or even drop brackets in order to correct your caster and your pinion angle. However, this still does come with some cam washers to adjust your caster, but I still highly would recommend an alignment after installing this kit. So as for tires go, 35s, like I mentioned, will fit very comfortably, fill up the wheel well, and look very good on this while still maintaining some good flex room. 33s will look a little bit small, however, you are going to get the most up travel with those. And as for 37s go, you will be able to fit those on there. However, if you're not running a flat fender, you won't have much room for flex and up travel at all. So because this is a quality kit with quality components, that will speak in the price, just being south of $1,200 at the moment. So there are other less expensive options on the page, however, some of those will have a rougher ride and sacrifice your drivability, and they may not even come with components that will come in this kit, like a front adjustable track bar. They may not even come with shocks, and they may not even come with adjustable sway bar end links. Personally, I think JKS is a very high quality brand. They make really good components that will last a long time, and that is something that you want to definitely take into consideration while you're looking for components to swap into your JK that directly affect your performance as well as your drivability. So install is going to be a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. This is nothing for the average person to tackle. If you don't have any experience with suspension work, I would take this to a trusted mechanic. I would like to mention that you will need exhaust spacers if you do have the 3.6 liter V6. If you have the 3.8, then you will not need the exhaust spacers to accommodate for the lift. And I also, again, would highly recommend an alignment after installing this kit. So speaking of the install, let's jump into that now. The tools that I used for my install today were an assortment of impact wrenches, a drill, an assortment of screwdrivers, a trim removal tool, a center punch, a pair of vice grips, an adjustable wrench, an assortment of pry bars, a dead blow, a hammer, a torque wrench, an assortment of wrenches, an assortment of ratcheting wrenches, a tape measure, an assortment of ratchets, an assortment of extensions, an 11/64 inch drill bit, a 5/16 inch drill bit, a step bit, a knockout tool, blue thread lock, safety glasses, and an assortment of sockets and swivel sockets. So first things first, you need to get your Jeep up on a lift or up on jack stands and chock the front or back wheels if you do have it on jack stands, and then we can remove the wheels with a 19mm deep socket and an impact wrench or a regular ratchet. So what I'm going to do next is just take off this splash guard so we have a little bit more room to work with. So I'm using a trim removal tool, and I am just going to pop these off. So you also have 2 on the back that are holding in the tabs here. So next thing we are going to do is support our front axle because we are going to lower it to get all of our suspension components out. So I usually like to put it in this little nook over here next to the control arm. I'm just gonna raise it up and keep it level. So we're not actually gonna be pushing up on the axle and jacking the axle up. We're just gonna be resting our pole jack against it. And this is going to just brace our axle when we're ready to lower it down when we're removing some suspension components. So now we can go ahead and move over to the sway bar end links. So first we're going to remove the bottom bolt. I'm just going to be using a 18mm deep socket and 18mm open-ended wrench. So you can use an impact on the other side. We're just limited here because of this track bar bracket. Take that one out. Then we can remove this top bolt with an 18mm deep socket. So we can do the same thing on this side. We can remove that bolt. So now we can remove this top nut to fully disconnect our sway bar end link. I'm going to be using a 19mm open-ended wrench to hold this ball joint socket over here, and then I'm going to use the same 18mm deep socket to remove this nut. So after we have our sway bar end links disconnected, we can disconnect our track bar. I'm going to be using a 21mm socket and an extension to clear our drag link here. We're just going to remove that. So after you've spun this and removed the flag nut, these can be a pain in the butt to get out. What I did is just took a pry bar. There is a little pass-through over here, so that will push that out. And then we can just pry the bolt out from there. So we got it out enough to hit it with the impact gun and unthread it from where it's sitting. So as you can see, the whole axle shifted left. That is okay, as long as it's supported, and that's why we did support that in the first place. So what we're gonna do, since we are actually replacing this, we might as well just disconnect the whole track bar. Since we are disconnecting the whole track bar, you are going to remove this top bolt here that's holding in the top of our track bar. You're going to be using a 3/16" wrench to grab this or hold this nut on the other side, and the same 21mm socket to remove the bolt. So now that we can move our track bar around and there's no pressure on this bolt, we can simply remove it and remove our track bar. So our next step will be to lower our axle. However, I don't want to stress out our brake line, so what we're going to do is take a 10mm socket and just remove those brackets, and we will be putting on different brackets as well. So now that it's disconnected, just keep that. We can do the same thing on the other side. So our next step is going to be to remove our shocks because this is limiting our axle, so we can't actually drop the axle just yet. So I did stick a 16mm ratcheting wrench over this top stud here. There is a nut up there, it is pretty hard to see, and then you can take a 16mm open-ended wrench and put that on this right here. That's going to prevent the shock body from actually moving. And what I like to do is just rest this here since it is pretty solid on there, and it will press up against the shock tower here. So now we can remove the bottom bolt, the bottom shock bolt, with an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. you can completely remove your shock. So now we're going to do the same thing on the other side, starting with the top shock nut and bolt up here with a 16mm ratcheting wrench and then a 16mm open-ended wrench. So now we can take off our bottom shock bolt. I'm going to be using an 18mm wrench. And also, since our differential is here, I'm going to switch it up to an 18mm swivel just to give us a little bit more room. So to make sure our axle drops low enough to get our springs out and our longer springs back in, and to make sure that our drive shaft doesn't bind when we do that, we're going to disconnect the drive shaft using a 15mm swivel. And we're just going to take out these 4 bolts you can see that are around the drive shaft. So as you can see, these do have blue Loctite on them, so I would recommend an impact. If you can't use an impact, then I would recommend a breaker bar and making sure that the drive shaft is not spinning while you're doing that. All right, so once those are out, we can just let that sit there. And what we can do as well is just put these bolts back in here. Just so we know where they are. So after the drive shaft is disconnected, we're ready to lower our axle and take out our springs. So you can start lowering that down, and I'm going to just go back and forth between the 2 pull jacks. Try to keep it as level as possible. See how low we can drop this. So we tried dropping down the axle and our brake lines did max out. So we are going to disconnect this bottom bracket with a 10mm ratcheting wrench. And you just have to remove this bolt here. And there is a tab holding it on the other side. You can do the same thing on the other side. So after everything is disconnected, we can start to lower our axle. So I'm just going to lower each one at a time, trying to keep the axle as even as possible. Just make sure our pull jacks are even and the arms are not hitting anything. So at this point, obviously you can see this big gap here. We're ready to take out our springs. I just lowered it a decent amount more than what we needed to because we are putting in longer springs. So after those are out, we can start assembling our front suspension. So now that we have everything out, we're ready to start our installation. And first we're gonna prep our spring perch to install our bump stop extension. So I am just going to mark a center punch hole. We are going to drill and tap a hole here so that we can attach this and put in our springs. So you can just take a center punch and just do what I just did. Mark the center of the spring perch. Make sure that everything is marked and we can go grab our drill bits. So after we have that center hole punched, I am going to drill a pilot hole with an 11/16 inch drill bit so we can prepare it for our 5/16 inch drill bit. So after your pilot hole is drilled, we can take that 5/16 inch drill bit and drill that out. So out of your J107 hardware bag, you are gonna take your self-tapping bolt, and we are going to put that right in the hole here. So then you can take a 9/16 inch socket and a ratchet, and we can tap this hole here. So this is going to give us a thread for our longer bolt that we will tie our bump stop extension down to. After that is easy to ratchet down, we can remove it. and that hole is officially tapped. So before we install our new springs, I did want to show you guys a little side-by-side of our stock ones. Obviously, you can tell that these are a lot shorter. This is where you're going to get all of your lift from, and they are actually going to be a little bit beefier. So they are a little bit heavier in weight, a little bit thicker in the coils. So these are going to be a lot more heavy duty than your stock springs are. So this new JKS spring is a dual rate progressive spring. So you have tighter coils at the bottom, and then you will have the looser and more spacious coils at the top, and that's going to give you your comfortability as well as performance, where your stock springs were mainly about comfortability. So enough about our stock springs, let's put in our new ones. So now we're ready to install our coil spring, and you want to make sure that your spacer is actually in your coil spring before we go ahead and maneuver this on here around that top bump stop. We can go ahead and maneuver onto the spring perch. This is where I wanted to disconnect everything and avoid a spring compressor. So let's see how well that will go. So now we have to secure down our bump stop extension here. So we're gonna grab the longer bolt from the J107 hardware bag with the provided washer and put that through the hole and tighten that down into the hole that we had tapped. Then you can take a 9/16 inch socket and a ratchet. I also would like to mention that these longer springs will be in the front, and we'll use the shorter springs for the rear. Then we can move this to be seated correctly. Perfect, and get our bolt. So after the springs are in, we can go ahead and move over to the shocks, but before we do that, we are going to put a little bit of pressure on the springs because they were moving around. They did have a little bit of space here, so you want to make sure that those are seated in place in the little notch here. So just check that. Just make sure that your spring is seated in this bottom channel here. So now on the topic of shocks, before we put these new ones in, I did want to just show you a little bit of side-by-side how these are going to accommodate you better with this type of lift. So there are two types of shocks. There are a hydraulic shock, like your stock one, that is prone to cavitation, which is forming inside of the shock, creating shock fade. It can leak and they can just wear out very quickly over time. Then you have a gas charge shock like the Fox Adventure Series 2.0s. These are going to have an internal floating piston to keep the oil and the gas separated, so that is going to allow a lot of performance as well as be able to take a lot of abuse, bumps at fast speeds, heavy duty washboards while you're out on the trail or racing, and these will have a very long lifespan because of that. It's going to reduce a lot of that shock fade. So as well as being durable on the inside and being able to offer all that performance, these are also durable on the outside compared to our stock shock that you can see that is starting to rust and chip over time, and these actually really aren't even that old. So the Fox Adventure Series 2.0 has a 2-inch clear anodized 6061 T6 aluminum body with a 5/8 inch chrome-plated, heat-treated alloy steel shaft. That was a mouthful, but this basically means that these are going to be durable and they'll be able to take some abuse on the trail, take a hit on the trail, no problem at all. So we also have nitrile bushings that we will press in here in just a minute. Those are gonna reduce any noise, any rattling around. Those are also gonna create a more comfortable ride and have a very long lifespan in comparison to our polyurethane bushing that you see here is already cracking. So let's go press in those bushings so we can put in our shocks. So now we can press in all of our bushings and all of our metal sleeves into our shocks. Just making note that these smaller bushings and these thinner sleeves will be for the rear shocks, like I have here, and then the thicker sleeves and the larger bushings will be for the front shocks. Right, after that's pressed in, we can grab our metal sleeve and press that one in as well. Do the same thing for all 4 shocks. So now we can install our front shock absorbers. So I am just going to place that in the top portion up there. Make sure that you have your nitrile bushing and your washer. Make sure that those line up. And then you can take your nut and thread that onto the top up there. So you can tighten down that top nut with a 3/4 inch wrench or a 19mm wrench. So I would recommend to put the bottom of the shock in the bottom shock mount, even just a little bit, just to hold the shock body in place, make sure it doesn't turn. And you want to tighten down this top nut. So what we're going to do next is secure down the bottom of the shock. We're just going to raise the axle up. The bushing in there is going to be pretty tight in the mount, so we are just going to position it and move our axle upward. So once that is lined up and sitting flush, everything's lined up, we can take the stock bolt and wiggle that through to tighten that down. So after that is secured down there, we can tighten that down with an 18mm socket and 18mm wrench. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. So what we're going to do next is attach our sway bar end link hardware. We are not attaching the sway bars at this time, but I do want to attach the hardware. So what you are going to do is insert your top pin with the rubber bushing and tighten that down. We'll tighten that down in just a minute. And then you can take the smaller pin with the tapered end. The bottom pins will be different from each other. And we can attach that to the bottom mount. So the reason why we're not attaching the sway bars yet is because we do have to measure them out since they are adjustable, and we need the Jeep on its own weight in order to do that. So we're just gonna attach the hardware and tighten this down with a 19mm deep socket, and I am going to use a small screwdriver to put through here just to keep this pin straight while we tighten down our nylon lock nut. So I'm just using this screwdriver to help me turn it, but at the end we will keep the hole in a place where we want to be able to access the pin very easily. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. I would like to mention that this bottom one is flat, and that's because of the track bar and steering stabilizer bracket right here. They actually made it shorter to easily maneuver the sway bar end link off of the pin here. So just make sure that this goes on this side. You actually probably won't be able to get the other longer pin on here. It might be a pain in the butt to do that, so just makes the most sense. Then we can tighten those down with our 18mm deep socket and our screwdriver. So now we can install our brake line drop brackets. So what you want to do is actually pop your brake line out of here. You can, I've already kind of bent it. You can bend it down since they are aluminum lines, just stretch it down. You are going to remove this ABS line from the bracket and disconnect the breather hose from the bracket as well. Since those are limited, you just pull that right out of there. It's a little Christmas tree. So you can clip that onto here so you'll be able to maneuver it. We can just put that breather hose aside just for a second, pull this ABS line out, let it sit back there, and we can install our drop brackets. So you can thread in the OEM bolt, and we'll tighten that down in just a second. We do want to get our brake line all bolted up here. We're just going to bend that. Try to straighten that out as much as we can to reach this bottom bracket here. We are going to tighten this up against the frame rail with a 10mm socket that we used before. And you want to make sure that this bolt hole is actually clear in the frame rail because we have hardware in our 768 hardware bag that we're going to attach to our brake line in just a moment. So we're going to take the bolt and washer and place that through the OEM bracket and our drop bracket. And then we can take a washer and the nylon lock nut they provided us and attach that to the back here. So now we can take an 11mm socket and ratchet and an 11mm open-ended wrench, and then we can tighten those brackets down. So after we've attached the top brake lines, we can do the same thing with the bottom, that bracket. So we just have to slip that back into place. Oh, there it goes. Once that is back in there, we can attach that 10mm bolt that we originally removed. Then we can tighten that down with our 10mm ratcheting wrench. So what I'm going to do is just shimmy this up a little bit and stick our breather back there for the moment. I'm going to bend this tab down. So we can attach our breather back onto here. Keep that in place. We're gonna attach the other side onto our shock tower. And you're all set, and then you can move to the other side and do the same thing. So now we can install our bracket at the top here. Take our OEM bolt. Real quick, we're gonna tighten that down with a 10mm socket. So now we can take our hardware that was provided on the other, just like on the other side, stick that through, take our, make sure that we have enough room here to work with. So now we can tighten that down with the 11mm wrench and socket. So now we can attach this bottom bracket here. You may need a flathead screwdriver or something to help push the bracket into where it's sitting. All right, there you go. Then you can line up the bolts and tighten that down with a 10mm ratcheting wrench. So for the 2012 to 2018 models, you will need a pack of exhaust spacers because the Y pipe will come in contact with the drive shaft if you don't extend the exhaust. So what we had to do is remove the 2 bolts that are holding on the exhaust flange for the Y pipe here. Those are going to be very rusted. That is very common. You may have to use heat and a lot of PB blaster or any penetrator to get those off. It will be a 13mm socket. We have already removed those off camera because they did give us some trouble. However, we are going to install our new exhaust spacers. Now, you are going to be using the shorter one for the driver's side and the longer one for the passenger side. So now I'm just going to use a pry bar and pry the exhaust back so we can fit the spacer in. So now we can do the passenger side. So now with our 814 hardware, we can insert the smaller bolts, the shorter bolts out of the hardware kit into the driver's side. This top one may be a little bit hard to access. We will have to pull this flange forward just a bit so we can tighten it down. We can take a 13mm socket and tighten those up. So I will be using a 13mm ratcheting wrench on the top bolt just because this is a tight spot with this crossover right here. So now we can bolt up our passenger side. So now if you are not installing new control arms, we do have to punch out the tabs in order to adjust our cam bolt. So we're going to take a 21mm wrench and a 21mm socket and remove this control arm so we can do that. So once that bolts out, we can pull our lower control arm out of the way. So now we're going to use our knockout tool to knock out these tabs in order to adjust our caster. So now we can use a 22mm deep socket and punch out those tabs. Now we can snap off these tabs and reinstall our control arm. So now we're going to do that for the inner portion of the mount as well. Cleaned up this hole here. What we're going to do now is attach our control arm with our cam bolt washers here. Now we are going to put our control arm in place, and these washers are going to be installed here. So this is going to allow our control arm to move backwards. So what we need to do is actually move the axle forward so we can get that bolt through. So once that is loosely installed, we can move over to the other side. So after those are in and set, we can move on to attaching our front drive shaft. However, I would highly recommend getting in alignment. This is just to move the control arm back, but you still need a professional to align your Jeep. So now we can move on to bolting up our drive shaft. So now we can attach our front drive shaft. We are going to move that back into place. Shouldn't be difficult at all. Then we are going to just thread these bolts in, just 1 or 2 threads. We do have to hit that with some blue Loctite before we can retorque those down. All right, so we're just gonna hit those with a touch of blue Loctite. And we can take a 15mm swivel and tighten those down. So we are finished with the front for now, so we're gonna move to the back and drop our axle. So I have the pull jacks here supporting our rear axle, and now we can take out our sway bar link. So I'm gonna be using an 18mm socket, an extension, and a 18mm wrench. So now we can remove our shocks. So we're going to start with the bottom shock bolt. We are going to use an 18mm open-ended wrench and an 18mm socket. So now we can remove the top bolts that are holding in the two tabs on the top of the shock. I'm going to be using a 16mm swivel and a 15-inch extension. I am going to remove the left one first, the innermost one first. And then I'm going to remove the outside one. And the reason I did that is so I can have a hand on the shock so it doesn't fall on me after I remove the bolt. Now we're going to remove the rear track bar bottom bolt with a 21mm socket. And before we lower the axle down, remove our brake line bracket from our frame, I am using a 10mm socket in order to do that. You can do the same thing on the other side and make sure to keep the hardware. We will be using it when we drop the bracket. So now we're ready to lower our axle down so we can take out our springs. Real quick, let's disconnect our breather hose so we don't stress that out. We're going to try to keep the axle as even as possible while we lower this down and watch all of our lines. So with a 10mm deep socket and an extension, we're just going to remove these two nuts here just so we can drop our emergency brake line bracket so we are not stressing those out when we're lowering the axle. Now we can continue to lower our axle down, save those nuts for later. So now this is low enough so we can maneuver our spring out. We can do that for both sides. So we're just going to pop out our spring. So we are stressing out this line here. We're just going to take a trim removal tool and pop that off. All right, so now our ABS sensor is freed up. We may have to remove a couple of more of those just to make sure that it is not stressed out when we put our new springs in. However, we are ready to pop in our springs. So now we can install our spring with the factory isolator. While holding those in place, you can lift up the rear axle just for enough compression to hold those still while we work on the rest of the Jeep. So our next step after putting in our springs is to drill out a hole for our OEM sway bar links. So we are going to measure out 1 1/4 inch above the center mark of our OE hole and center punch it so we can drill a 1/2 inch hole for our bolt. That is 1 1/4. Take my center punch, make a mark. So I marked a center punch hole. We're just going to do it a couple more times, make a divot for our step bit. Now we're ready to drill. So now we're going to drill a pilot hole before we go in with our step bit. So now I'm going to use a step bit. I marked off a 1/2 inch with a piece of tape just so I know when to stop, but we can go ahead and drill that pilot hole out. Now you can do the same thing on the other side. So you're gonna use a smaller drill bit to drill a pilot hole. I'm just using an 11/64 inch bit. So we can go ahead and drill that pilot hole. Now we can install our bump stop extension, just as shown. And there are already holes down here, so we are going to take our J106 hardware bag, stick our bolts through, and then we can attach our nut down on the bottom. Get the other one attached, and then we can tighten those both down. So I am going to be using a 13mm open-ended wrench and a 13mm ratcheting wrench to do that. All right, then we can do that same process on the other side. So now we're ready to install our rear shock. So what I'm gonna do first is install one of these bolts so we can hook our tab onto it, and then we can hold this in place and bolt it in the other side. So I'm just going to thread in the bolt farthest for me. So once that is most of the way threaded in, we can put our shock up here. Hold that in place while we thread in the other side. So we're just going to keep these loosely installed so when we raise our axle up, we can maneuver the shock body around in order to get it in the lower mount here. Just going to do the same thing on the other side here. Connect the inside bolt first. Our shock tab on there. And really whatever bolt is easiest for you to access once it's on there, you can do. So now we're ready to raise up our axle to meet the bottom of our shocks. We just want to make sure that these are oriented in the correct position so we can get our bolt through. Make sure our sway bar links are out of the way of everything. Now we can put our bolt through. So we can tighten that down with an 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench. So what I did was just raise the axle a couple turns so our tabs are sitting flush on the top of the shock mount. So now we're going to tighten those down with a 16mm swivel and a 15-inch extension. So now we're going to install our track bar bracket. So this will just be placed over the axle here. You want to make sure that that bottom tab that you just saw is lined up with the OEM bolt hole. So we are going to, for the time being, bolt that through. We do have another bracket to install, but we're going to make sure that this is secured so we can bolt down the rest of this before we put in our riser bracket. All right, so just to hold that in place for the time being, we are going to lower this pull jack, get it out of here, since our shocks are holding up our axle right now, and we can grab our other hardware. So now from our hardware packet J103, we're gonna take our U-bolt and stick that through the holes here to hold this bracket onto our axle. We're going to take the provided washers and place those on there. And then take our nylon lock nut. All right, while we have our bracket in place and our U-bolt on, we can position our riser bracket in here and stick our OEM bolt through that and attach our flag nut on the back here. So before we tighten that down and tighten our U-bolt down, we are going to install the 2 bolts that are connecting our riser bracket with our track bar relocation bracket. So it'll be in the same hardware kit, J103. And so this does not interfere with our track bar when it's in there. We are going to place those bolts facing outward. All right, do the bottom one. Those are in. So now we can go ahead and tighten everything down. So I'm just going to start with these 2 bolts that we just installed. You're gonna need a 14mm socket and a 14mm wrench. And we're just going to tighten those down. I'm also using an extension because of the depth of the bracket. Do the top one as well. So now we can tighten down this U-bolt bracket with a 19mm deep socket and a ratchet. So now we can tighten down our OEM bolt with a 21mm socket. So now we're ready to reinstall our rear track bar. We can place that in the bracket and take our new hardware from the J103 package. Line that up and push that through. Now we can put the washer and the nut on the back of the track bar bolt. So now we can tighten down the track bar bolt with a 7/8" wrench on the back nut, and then we can use a 21mm socket on the front bolt. So now we can reattach our emergency brake line to the tub. So now we can install our brake line bracket in the OEM location with the OEM bolt. Line up our brake line, tighten our bracket down, and take our provided hardware from the 768 hardware bag and bolt that through. And you can take an 11mm deep socket and 11mm wrench, tighten that down. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. So now we can line up our sway bars and attach our hardware. So this is the OEM hardware that we're using. Now we can tighten those down with an 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench. So I did tell you guys that we were saving our track bar and our sway bar end links for last, just because we do have to measure them and get the Jeep down on its own weight so we can make some fine adjustments. But I did want to show you guys right next to our stock components how these are comparing. So starting off with the track bar, you can tell that this is a lot beefier. It is also adjustable, so you can completely recenter your axle after you lift your Jeep and correct a lot of that geometry that has to do with your front axle. Like I said, it's also going to be beefier. It's going to be more durable. It's not going to bend or flex when you have heavier tires on it. I would like to mention that the joints, though, are pretty much similar to your factory track bar. A lot of other ones on the market do have an eyelet joint there, but that's no big deal. This is definitely going to hold up a lot better. So moving on to the sway bar end links, these are one of the best ones that I've personally seen in the aftermarket parts world for sway bar end links. These are fully adjustable. They're going to accommodate for your lift, and this is the quicker disconnect set. So if you don't have the Rubicon with the electric sway bar disconnect, these will be installed over pins that you saw me install earlier. This is a Sahara behind me, so we did do that. All you have to do is pull a pin at the trailhead and you're ready to go. You can store these up and out of the way instead of your stock ones where you do have to grab a couple tools and disconnect those manually before you hit the trail. So even with these disconnected, these are still going to give you some good articulation, and they also have Zerk fittings because they're fully greasable and they will last you a long time. So now we can adjust our sway bar end links. So for this kit specifically, they do have to be 9 inches from the center to center of the two ends here, and then your track bar will be 32 1/4 of an inch. So we are going to grab our tape measure and see where we are at now. We're going to center our joints. So we're at 8 inches. So we are going to loosen this. So now we can tighten down our jam nut. So we can do that on both links. All right, so those are adjusted. Then we can move on to adjusting our track bar. And it is preset to 32 1/4 inches. This was right out of the box, so perfect. Now we can go ahead and install those. So now we can install our sway bar links. Since we installed the quicker disconnect pins, we can just slide those on and slide our pins on. If you do have a Rubicon with the electric sway bar disconnect, you will have to use the bolts. However, it is basically the same process minus the pin. Now we can take a grease gun and grease our sway bar links. Now we can install our new track bar. Just gonna rest it in the mount down there and grab our OEM bolt.
Okay.
Now we can tighten down our track bar bolts. So you're gonna use a 21mm socket on the bottom one because it has a flag nut on the back. Now you can take a 21mm wrench and a 21mm socket and tighten down the top track bar bolt. So if you are having trouble getting the track bar into place on the other side, you can put this on its own weight and have somebody turn the steering wheel back and forth to shimmy it into place. So that's going to wrap it up for my review and install on the JKS Jspec 3.5-inch lift kit fitting all 2007 to 2018 four-door JK Wranglers. For more videos like this, keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.